Okay, we're looking at this book, Evidence Demands a Verdict, and hope you're okay today. And we're looking at page 37, and the issue of Jesus' history is unknowable. If one were to study historically the life of Jesus of Nazareth, he would find a very remarkable man, not the Son of God. It is also sometimes attested to me this way. Following the modern historical approach, one would never discover the resurrection. Do you know, it is true. Before you jump to a conclusion, let me explain. For many today, the study of history is incorporated with the ideas that there is no God, miracles are not possible. We live in a closed system and there is no supernatural. With these assumptions or presuppositions, they begin their critical, open and honest investigation of history. And when they study the life of Christ and read about his miracles or resurrection, they conclude that it was not a miracle or a resurrection because we know not historically but philosophically that there is no God. We live in a closed system of miracles are not possible and there is no supernatural. Therefore these things cannot be. John W. Montgomery writes, the fact of the resurrection cannot be discounted on a priori philosophical grounds. Miracles are impossible only if one defines them, but such definition rules out proper historical investigation. Josh says, I quote Montgomery quite extensively on this issue because he has stimulated my thinking about history. He says, Kant conclusively showed that all arguments and systems begin with presuppositions, but this does not mean that all presuppositions are equally desirable. It is better to begin, as we have, with presuppositions of method, which will yield truth, rather than with presuppositions of substantive content, which assume a body of truth already. In our modern world, we have found that the presuppositions of empirical method best fulfill this condition, but note that we are operating only with presuppositions of scientific method, not with rationalistic assumptions of scientism, the religion of science, Montgomery. Usenga's comments are cited by Montgomery concerning historical skepticism. Usenga states, the strongest argument against historical skepticism is this: the man who doubts the possibility of correct historical evidence and tradition cannot then accept his own evidence, judgment and combination and interpretation. He cannot limit his doubt to his historical criticism, but is required to let it operate in his own life. He discovers at once that he not only lacks conclusive evidence in all sorts of aspects of his own life that he had quite taken for granted, but also that there is no evidence whatsoever. In short, he finds himself forced to accept a general philosophical skepticism along with his historical skepticism, and general philosophical skepticism a nice piece of intellectual game, but one cannot live by it. Miller Burroughs of Yale, the American expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, also cited by Montgomery, writes, there is a type of Christian faith rather strongly represented today that regards the affirmation of Christian faith as confessional statements with the individuals accepts a member of the believing community, and which are not dependent on reason and evidence. Those who hold this position will not admit that historical investigation can have anything to say about the uniqueness of Christ. They are often skeptical as to the possibility of knowing anything about the historical Jesus, and seem content to dispense with such knowledge. I cannot share this point of view. I am profoundly convinced that the historic revelation of God in Christ Jesus of Nazareth must be the cornerstone of any faith that is really Christian. Any historical question about the real Jesus who lived in Palestine 19 centuries ago is therefore fundamentally important. Historian Philip Schaff added to the above, the purpose of the historian is not to construct a history from preconceived notions and to adjust it to his own liking, but to reproduce it from the best evidence and to let it speak for itself. So there's a couple of issues there. There's the postmodern issue concerning history. The idea that we can't really know anything about history. Well, if that's the case, why is there various postmoderns readings of history? In other words, if you say there's no objective history, then why be dogmatic about your postmodernism? So which is, either way you look at it, there's always going to be a meta-narrative involved in reading history. So what I'm saying is this skepticism of postmodernism is a form of knowledge. It's a dogmatic form of knowledge in a way. It's saying that we can't know anything about history. But that is not that is a dogmatic statement to make. That's the point. And in order to maintain that dogmatic position, you've got to argue your case. You've got to look at history in order to prove your point. So in other words, you can never get away from the modernist understanding of history, that is, that we can get objective evidence. The second thing is that we have to acknowledge that presuppositions do play a central role in our interpretation of any evidence and historical information. That doesn't mean to say that we can't know what history is about. It just means that we have these presuppositions and we have to be willing to filter them and to put them in check if they're biasing our examination of the evidence. And so when a skeptic says Jesus never rose again because miracles don't happen, that is a metaphysical, philosophical bias. What we should do as historians is investigate the evidence and be open either way. I know that some historians might say, or skeptical historians might say, well, we're always skeptical about the historical data that we look at. Yes, but if there is multiple attestation of an event, and it's good historical eyewitness material, then there's got to become a point where you've got to be at least willing to consider your position and to be open and say, well, okay, miracles as far as I'm concerned don't happen, but this does seem to have unusual historical validity, and you have to be open to the historical data. Take for example David Hume. You can find this information in Gary Habermas's PhD. David Hume set up a criteria of investigating miracles, and he used this criteria on miracles that had happened in 1700s, I think it was. Was it 1700s or 1600s in France, in the time of Pascal? And these French Catholics were having miracle experiences. So Hume, some many years later, in the next century, looking back, using this criteria, investigated these miracles, and he said, according to my criteria, these miracles took place. But yet Hume, who was a skeptic, still didn't believe. So in other words, we have these biases that come into play when we're reading historical information, and we've got to be careful about that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean to say that we can't know about history. You've got to get a balance between modernism and postmodernism readings of history. Alright. If you want to know more about that, go to Licona's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, Licona, IVP. And there, the first 100 pages, he goes into history and why we can read history, biases in history, etc. Alright?